Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH. What would happen if you took the absolute best workstation processor and then you made it better? Well, you'd probably be AMD with the Threadripper Pro, and you'd probably take your 5995WX and you'd probably turn it into this. Now, this is the AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5995WX, and it has a lot of letters, but it also has a lot of cores and a lot of really cool features, and that's exactly what we're gonna go over today. Frankly, I really hope that they just call this thing a WEPYC because it's a workstation epic, and to me, that makes sense. Come on, AMD, I don't want to be saying AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5995WX. It's just way too long in branding. Let's just call it the WEPYC. Now, you might have noticed by now that this WEPYC processor is in the Gigabyte motherboard. And you'll also probably notice that this motherboard has an absolutely crazy number of PCIe slots, has tons of expansion on it. Plus, I mean, it has a 64 core processor that has 128 threads, and you get a total of 8 DIMM slots, so you can add a ton of memory in this thing as well. Oh, and it supports ECC, and it has a BMC, so you could use this as a server. And you might be thinking, well, Patrick, you're just holding that up because it's convenient. It would be too hard to hold up an entire workstation, right? And I know I hang servers a lot, but we're actually not going to do that this time. We also have a Supermicro AS5014 A-TT, and that system is a workstation that is completely built and ready to go, and it's also based on the exact same processor. So we have a couple of these different ones. And we actually would have had more, but there's a little snafu, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the processor first, and then we're gonna get into some of the systems and performance and all that kind of stuff that you guys wanna definitely know. We'll have all of these, chapters already marked down in the description, and so we should get chapter markers on YouTube as well. So if you wanna skip around, you can totally go do that. But we have a lot of really cool things that I just want to show off, and we're going to use this video to go do that. Okay, so first off, what is an AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5995WX? Well, the simple answer to it is it's a Milan EPYC that's made for the workstation. And AMD does not like when you say that, but that's basically what it is. There are a couple of changes that AMD basically made to the Milan server CPU to really make it into a workstation product that could be used by a lot of folks that would generally use this kind of higher core count workstation. One of the things that they did was you'll notice that none of the platforms that we're seeing are actually 2 DIMMs per channel. So we're only getting 1 DIMM per channel, which practically means that you get like half the memory capacity of a full-fledged server Milan AMD EPYC 7003 series CPU. The second thing is that at this time, we do not have a Threadripper Pro X, even though there's a WX at the end of this. This is not like a Milan X. Just because there's that X there does not mean we get the 3D cache, and we get a total of 768 megabytes of level 3 cache. Nope, we don't get that in this generation. It's still only 256. I guess that's a lot as well. The other big change is that, well, they made it basically work as a workstation. And what I mean by that is they have a chipset, which is the WRX 80 chipset. And the reason that that's a big deal is because if you have a chipset, you can do things that you can't do if you don't have one, and that's really oversubscribed. So if you think about how a modern CPU is built, you have PCIe lanes, and you may not want to necessarily use all of your PCIe lanes for things like USB connectivity. For example, like if you want to go put an audio codec in there, you don't necessarily need to have a full direct PCIe Gen 4 by 16 line into the CPU. So what you do is you basically put it on a PCH, and you go put some other IO on that, and then you use an uplink to the CPU, which is usually a PCIe Gen 4 by 8 uplink, and that gives you the ability to have still a lot of bandwidth, but it also gives you more, connectivity option. All right, so let's get into what is really different about this versus the previous generation. The previous generation, which is the Threadripper Pro 3995WX, well, that one was a basically Rome generation EPYC. So with this upgrade from Rome generation to a Milan generation architecture, we go from Zen 2 to Zen 3, and Zen 3 is absolutely one of the most awesome upgrades that you can get. And one of the biggest drivers for that is frankly the new cache structure. So what AMD did in the Zen 3 architecture that's used by Milan, that's used by this generation of Threadripper Pro, the 5000 series, is it unified the CCD cache. So basically there's a cache that sits on each of the little dies. There's 8 dies total in the CPU. There's a big IO hub in the middle, or IO die in the middle, and then you have all the little compute dies, and those little compute dies are called CCDs, and each one of those basically had 2 hemispheres in the previous generation Rome, and they acted more or less as kind of like independent units realistically. And what they did with this new generation was they said, hey, actually instead of having two different hemispheres, we're gonna go kind of like unify the cache, so it's kind of like more like a unified coherent die. And that was like one of the biggest things that AMD did with Zen 3, and frankly, it leads to absolutely massive performance improvements. You're gonna notice that we are using the Milan slides here because frankly, they're better at explaining this than most of the Threadripper stuff that's like kind of, I don't really understand a lot of the marketing behind it, but frankly, the Milan slides are, more or less relevant in this, other than a couple little things that I mentioned earlier. But you definitely see a couple of those on this slide. Like for example, we have this slide from Milan that says there's no chipset, but obviously on the Threadripper side, we do have a chipset. But just to kind of give you an idea, this is the right idea. Now, the other thing we get with Zen 3 is we also get the ISA improvements or enhancements. And what AMD basically did was they didn't just say, hey, we're gonna go and change our core. They're actually improvements to different instructions. There are different parts of the processor that are actually faster with this generation versus previous generations. And so the net impact of that is that we actually do have a faster IPC just based on, even if you didn't make the cache changes, but then with the cache changes, you get even more uplift. And so this was one where we didn't necessarily get more cores because we still have 64 cores, but in a lot of benchmarks, you're getting 20-30% more performance. And so frankly, a lot of folks are like, sure, we don't get more cores, but we get more performance per core. So that's not bad either. Now we're gonna talk a little bit more about the platform when we look at the platforms a little bit later in this video, because obviously that makes sense. But what I want to do is also just take a second and talk about the entire product line. So AMD actually has 5 CPUs in the new AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5000 series, and this is the top bin one. And AMD sent us this one. This is a 64-core processor. We have them from other sources as well, but AMD did send us one of the processors that you're seeing. And along with the 64-core part, there's a 32-core, a 24-core, a 16, and I think a 12-core part. The 24-core is really the new core count part for this generation. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, Patrick, why would you ever get a 32-core when you could get a 64-core part? Well, frankly, 32-core part is less expensive. And then also, just in the world of these professional workstations, there are still a lot of things that are actually licensed on a per core basis. And so the idea that, you may have, which is like, oh, well, why would you want more cores when you could, of course you want more cores. Not everybody subscribes to that because there are a lot of applications where just having more performance per core is actually better than having more cores, because if your software license costs are, many thousands of dollars per core, frankly, you don't want to pay for 64 cores of lower performance per core because that gets way too expensive. These Threadripper Pro CPUs have just completely shaken this market up. In fact, Lenovo says that its P620, which we reviewed in the 3995 generation, I think it's like Tom's Hardware actually beat us by a couple hours in terms of publishing the review. So what are you gonna do? But we were second to go and publish that review. But the interesting thing is that Lenovo actually says that like the P620 is now by far the best-selling workstation in its class, because the Threadripper Pro is frankly awesome. And I know a lot of folks are gonna be really upset and they're gonna say like, hey, Threadripper, that was like the gaming CPU, and then like now, this is like costs way more, it's not really a gaming CPU anymore. And like, yeah, that's definitely the case, because really the market that AMD is targeting with the Threadripper Pro series is really like the folks that, like me, that used to use dual Xeon server class workstations, and now they're basically saying, hey, you actually don't need 2 CPUs, you can have a single CPU, and we're gonna give you more performance, and we're gonna give you more capacity in terms of I/O and all that kind of stuff, but we're gonna do it in a single socket. And that's really what AMD is doing, and why the Threadripper Pro has become so popular, because you don't need a dual socket workstation anymore. You can have a single socket workstation. And on that workstation note, why don't we go look at some of the workstation platforms, because we've actually reviewed a couple of them, and we have a couple more to go do reviews of. We'll probably do in the next couple days or weeks. And so I think that this is a good opportunity to go kind of look at like what these systems look like from a number of vendors. Now, the Lenovo ThinkStation P620 definitely holds a special place. It was really the launch platform for the Threadripper Pro, and AMD gives like Lenovo some exclusivity on the new CPUs. We were actually going to test the new 5995WX version of the P620, but our system went to Memphis on FedEx and then apparently didn't make its way to Austin, and it just kind of, I don't know, somebody is just cruising around, I guess, in Memphis with like a $30,000 workstation, or just, maybe somebody decided, hey, that box in the corner that's going overnight to Patrick, we're just gonna leave that in the corner. I don't know exactly what happened to it, but we already reviewed that one like over a year and a half ago. ago, so we definitely have experience with that platform. We'll link the review in the description, and basically just think that this would be the upgrade of that one with the new processor. But that does practically mean that because we don't have that system, we can't actually do a just complete apples to apples comparison with the previous gen. We're just going to still use the numbers, and we're going to use the Supermicro system, which is probably the closest one that we have to that Lenovo. But at the same time, just want to say that they are going to be different systems because somebody decided that they wanted to walk away with it. And I will just note that we also will link in the description. In the previous generation, we also looked at the ASUS Workstation platform for the Threadripper Pro. In fact, if you want to see something that's really fun that we did with that, you can actually see our cluster or ultimate cluster in a box video. And that one, we actually took this exact Threadripper Pro system from ASUS, and then we basically put in a whole bunch of NVIDIA DPUs, and we created a ARM plus AMD cluster, which was super cool, and definitely go check that out. Now, of course, if we were doing it today, we would flash the BIOS on that ASUS system, and we would put the new Threadripper Pro 5995WX in, because then it would be the ultimate cluster in a box again. But instead, let's go look real quick at this Gigabyte platform where we can actually see a lot of the features already just kind of bare and on this board. Now, just recall the fact that the AMD EPYC Milan series, the 7003 series, and also the ROM, they have a total of 128 PCIe lanes. Now, these are PCIe Gen 4 lanes, but the basic idea is that by having those PCIe Gen 4 lanes, you don't need to have a chipset, but on the workstation side, you actually do have a chipset. But you're still working with the same Milan underpinning, so you still have that base 128 lanes. The vast majority of motherboard manufacturers, I don't know if there's any other way to do this, they take a by a PCIe Gen 4 and they actually take that and put that into the chipset, which is right here. But I mean, the big feature that you're definitely going to see here is the fact that there are 7 PCIe by 16 slots, but they're not all by 16 slots. So let's hold that thought first, because there's actually a total of 6 PCIe Gen 4 by 16 slots, and then there's 1 by 8. And the reason that one's only by 8 is, well, number one, because most likely it's going to be covered by a double width card anyway, but also you're going to end up having some lanes that you need to go split off to go do things like service the chipset, and that's why you have only 8 lanes going to that PCIe slot. But this Gigabyte board is super flexible because not only do you have those PCIe lanes, but you also have things like you have M.2 slots, you have slim slots, so you can go and cable up NVMe drives or something like that. You also can have SATA on this board. And so there's a lot of different options out there. I don't necessarily think a lot of people are going to go and buy like a super expensive CPU. I think these motherboards are in like the $750, $850 range, depending on the retailer and time of day and all that kind of stuff. So these are definitely not cheap motherboards by any stretch of the imagination. And so I just don't think that people are going to go put like, a 2 terabyte rotating hard drive in there. Like most people are going to use NVMe SSDs these days. So really effectively using those PCIe lanes is super important. Another feature that we're seeing in a lot of these Threadripper motherboards, like I think all of the Threadripper Pro motherboards, is we're actually seeing a baseboard management controller. Now we have a whole, what is a baseboard management controller? We'll link that in the description as well. If you don't know, it's basically a way to manage a server out of band. And this actually has that server technology built in. And we've seen that on the other systems that we've reviewed as well. And why I think that matters is that if you kind of look at like what the I/O is on this, we do get things like audio, we get USB and all that kind of good stuff, which is really nice for a workstation. Frankly, if you're using a just kind of normal EPYC motherboard, you're not going to get like audio on board as an example. But the other thing we get is we get 2 1 gig Ethernet ports and 2 10G base T ports. And so why this all matters is something that if you've never used this class of workstation, you probably haven't ever experienced. But I kind of first experienced with like a Sun system like way back when I was in college. And then, as I had the dual Xeon workstations, something that would inevitably happen was that I'd have a workstation, and that workstation would be like my primary workstation. It'd be all awesome until, of course, I would build the new one, and then I'd have the next generation workstation. And then I had the old one that was just kind of like sitting there. And one of the really cool things is that if you do have, this baseboard management controller, which a lot of the dual Xeon ones actually did have, well, if you have that on these Threadripper Pro boards, you can actually reuse these as like a server, right? I mean, you can have ECC RDIMMs, you have plenty of, CPU cores, you have plenty of PCIe lanes, you can do storage, you can do all the kinds of things that you would want. So you can actually turn these things directly into servers, and Gigabyte actually has like things like not only a workstation, like a tower workstation, but they also have a 1U server based on this motherboard because I guess they realized the fact that, hey, this could actually make a good server as well. Now, the Supermicro folks sent the AS5014 ATT to me, and frankly, some of the older Supermicro workstations that I've had personally were super boring. Let's call it what it is. They just kind of like, they're a little box, and they're actually black. They weren't beige, but I mean, they were just kind of like, they were there. They didn't look particularly good, but they had a lot of power in them, so they were really good. But this is actually something that is quite attractive, actually. Now we're gonna go through the entire system in its own review, and tell me if you want me to do a video of that. I think we're just gonna do a main site review, but I do want to kind of look at the motherboard and some of the features that are inside, because there are actually NVMe SSDs inside. They're just mounted internally, and behind this kind of really cool shroud that I'm kind of mediocre on. I have to say I really like the look of it, but I didn't like actually having to service the system behind it. So I'm kind of like torn on it, but behind it you actually have a big old motherboard. That motherboard is the Supermicro M12 SWATF. But that big old motherboard has a 64 core Threadripper Pro 5995WX on it, and you can see that this thing doesn't just have 8 DIMMs on, 4 on each side, but this is actually a liquid-cooled workstation. Now, frankly, a lot of the workstations that we see with Threadripper Pro are liquid-cooled. In fact, when I built one for myself, I actually built it liquid-cooled as well. So I really like the idea of Supermicro doing that, and they actually have a big triple fan radiator on the top of the system. And that triple fan radiator is really what's managing to keep the processor cool, because frankly, this processor uses a lot of power. It's a 280 watt TDP processor, but it definitely uses a lot of power. Other really cool things about this is that it actually has 4 M.2 slots. So if you want to go and have M.2 SSDs in here, you can totally go do that. Now the 2.5-inch SSDs that we have, those are actually Kioxia CD6 SSDs. So we did a review on that. We can link that in the description as well. But just want to say thank you to Kioxia for making sure that we have those drives. So thank you guys. The other kind of cool thing that I just want to show you guys real quick is that we actually have, and this is something that a lot of people ask about, we actually have Windows installed on the Kioxia SSDs, and we're actually using AMD RAID to go do that, because of course, Windows, you might want RAID. Now, this is not necessarily as good as having like a RAID controller. If you really want to have a RAID controller, you can knock yourself out and go put one in this system. But I do want to just say, like, hey, you actually can have a RAID setup in this platform, and here it is. Other big features are that we do get an ASpeed AST 2600, so we do get a management interface, and we do get that whole IPMI and out-of-band management experience with Supermicro, like we would expect from a Supermicro server. And this is their newer generation of that, so I think that's absolutely awesome. We also, for a management port, you get both a 1 gigabit, which is an Intel i210 port, and then that's a shared port between data and also the IPMI. But then you also get a 10G base T port, which is an AQC 1113C, if I remember right. But that was an Aquantia chip that is now a Marvell chip, and it's actually pretty common in these Threadripper Pro systems. So kind of cool that we actually get a 10G base T in this one as well. And that is definitely something that we're seeing in a lot of these Threadripper Pro systems. Of course, if you want something faster, you can go put like a giant DPU or something in the PCIe slots and go wild and have like dual 100 gig. If you really want to go do that, you totally can. But of course, if you have a giant 64 core CPU and maybe you're going to go put that 100 gig DPU in there, you're going to want to have a GPU as well for a lot of folks. And so we actually do have the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3090 Ti, which is, considered a consumer workstation GPU, but it's really, let's call it what it is. It's really not. It's more a professional graphics card. But for normal professional graphics card, also PNY sent this card over here, which is the NVIDIA RTX A4500. And so we are going to be taking a look at this. This would be something that would have been a Quadro in a previous generation. Still, we have some GPU options that we're going to be testing in all of these Threadripper systems. Now, of course, we're going to do these systems on the STH main site. So of course, go keep checking that out. Subscribe to the newsletter down in the description, because you're going to definitely want to see when we do those reviews. But at the same time, let's go talk about performance for a little bit, and let's kind of get into that. Okay, so what are we going to do instead of just flashing up like a whole bunch of little charts over and over again? I mean, realistically, people are just going to want to know, what the old Threadripper did compared to this one. And so we're just going to kind of make this really simple, and we're just going to go and put these all in a big chart. And I'm just going to kind of just talk in broad strokes here. We're not going to go into like individual benchmarks, because frankly, a lot of these systems are going to be doing different things. And what people really want to know is like, is it faster? Of course it is. And Zen 3 on pretty much every benchmark is somewhere in that, like, let's call it like, I don't know, 20 to 30-ish% range. I generally think of like Zen 2 to Zen 3 as like a 20 to 30% performance increase over Zen 2. So I really kind of see this as a pretty nice, actually a pretty nice upgrade in terms of speed. I also think that if you're using the lower core counts, which we don't actually have, but if you are using the lower core counts, because you are in a per core licensed software thing, and especially if you have like a 16 core or something like that, I think that having these types of parts where, you know, you have a high TDP, you can hit higher clock speeds and you know, all that kind of stuff, because, and just more per core performance because you're on Zen 3. I really think that, you know, for this per core licensed software folks, this is a big deal because, you know, this is a lot more performance per core. 20 to 30% more performance is like, you know, for some people getting tens of thousands of dollars worth of performance for free, just to kind of put that into perspective when you're talking about these professional workstations. Now, the base clock is the same 2.7 gigahertz, and you're gonna see that the turbo clock is actually a lot higher in this generation versus the previous generation, or the maximum turbo clock. The maximum turbo clock on the 5995WX is actually 4.5 gigahertz, which is up from 4.2 gigahertz. And you might be able to hit that in like a single threaded workload or dual threaded workload or something like that. But realistically, you know, a lot of folks, if you have 64 cores in a processor, you probably want to use all 64 cores. And when you go do that, you're going to see that, you know, we typically don't actually get, you know, a full 4 gigahertz or anything like that. In fact, here, let's just go run Cinebench, and I've been running that while I'm talking, and what you're gonna see is that, you know, we're in that like maybe a little, like maybe 3 to 3.1 or so gigahertz range across all 64 cores as we're running Cinebench. And just so you guys know, this system, although the uptime is very short, it was actually running a lot right before this, so it's pretty hot, just in general. And this system is still getting around 70-ish thousand. I think the last run that we were doing when we did this was like 69 and change, but the run that we did after this, I think we got like 71,000 or so. So, you know, on Cinebench R23, you're definitely seeing some pretty darn nice multi-core performance, but also just kind of shows you that when you actually are running this thing and you are loading up all the cores, you don't get that full like 4.5 gigahertz. You're getting something much lower than that, between maybe like 3 to 3.1, maybe 3.2 in some cases, but you know, you're probably more in that range. Overall though, the big takeaway is that you do definitely get more performance per core in this generation because we went from Zen 2 to Zen 3. Now, in terms of power consumption, we're also seeing just kind of the Supermicro system. We tried getting the closest config that we could to the Lenovo system, and we got about 10-ish% more power consumption, but at the same time, we're getting like 20 to 30% more performance than we got. And also, I can tell you that, you know, on the Rome to EPYC side, we would see more power being consumed on the Milan versus the Rome chips. So I do think that on the EPYC side, you know, we saw a pretty similar increase in performance, and I think that's what we're seeing here as well. On the noise side, we're not going to do noise because that's kind of more a platform thing rather than a CPU thing. So we're gonna push to our platform reviews for that. So if you guys want to see like Supermicro noise, it's definitely not silent, I'll just say that, but we're gonna really kind of address that more in our main site review. Okay, so let's take the key lessons learned, because I've been doing that lately and I really kind of like it, and especially in this context, I think it's super important. What do we know? So first off, like, yeah, the Zen 3, the move to Zen 3 and the Milan architecture, yeah, you get a lot more performance for this. You get like 20-30% more performance, even though you're not necessarily increasing the number of cores. Now, the next big core count jump is going to be Genoa. Genoa is allegedly going to launch later this year. In fact, it's not actually scheduled to launch like that much in the future. It's not like, I can tell you guys, I'm not expecting that we're going to be doing Genoa reviews in September, because otherwise I'm going to throw something at somebody at AMD for not telling me by now. But we're not going to be doing Genoa. I don't plan to be doing Genoa in September at this point, because we definitely don't have it we're not doing it right now. At the same time, because we're talking about server processors, I do think it's really important when we just kind of look at these things, because what's going to end up happening is that the EPYC side is actually going to step up, and you're going to have Genoa, and you're going to have, you know, 12 memory channels, you're going to have 96 cores. I mean, those are going to be much bigger. They're going to be more expensive, but they're going to be much bigger chips. And they're also going to use a lot more power, by the way. But at the same time, if you're not necessarily bound by the performance per core, then, I mean, if you can wait 6 months or so till maybe there's some availability, hopefully, maybe you can get a Genoa platform, and maybe that would be interesting. So that's kind of my challenge, is just the fact that this thing is launching just so much later than Milan. I mean, it's not even like the top end Milan. There's actually Milan X. So if you have a workload that actually just can use a whole bunch of level 3 cache, well, you're probably better off trying to like make a Frankenstein system out of a Milan X CPU rather than using the Threadripper Pro, which is kind of weird as well, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I really like the new processor. I mean, if you're just looking at the old version versus the new one, yeah, it's great. And by the way, these things are way better than the Threadripper 1000 and 2000 series. These things are just like, you know, a complete different ball game once we got to the 3995WX and now the 5995WX. But at the same time, I mean, I just kind of feel like we're hitting this too late in the cycle. Like, I really wish that this was a little bit earlier in the cycle. I mean, AMD is literally selling selling these 64 core CPUs to cloud providers for like, I mean, less than $2,000, right? And so the fact is that I kind of feel like they're making so much margin on the workstation market that like, I get that the cloud guys have big orders, but like, why can't we get them? And you're making high margin on them anyway. So why can't we have those in the workstation market? I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I'm sure somebody at AMD is like, yeah, but by the way, the cloud guys are ordering like 100,000 at a time, so they get priority. Sure, I get it. Still, it kind of feels like it's just too late to be getting a Milan CPU in the DIY market. The other thing though is I just don't really like the Lenovo exclusivity, especially early exclusivity on these and like, the OEM exclusivity. I really feel like, frankly, we should get these things sooner. And let me show you an example. So the Supermicro BIOS that this thing came with, by the way, was actually dated February 2022. So that means that this Supermicro system has been on the 2.0 BIOS, been able to support these Threadripper Pro CPUs since February, but the official launch is like now, which is like the summer of 2022, like a quarter and a half, 2 quarters later. That's just crazy, right? Also, Lenovo, which has the ThinkStation P620, which has always been the first one with the Threadripper Pro, maybe I get the fact that they're the lead customer, and so maybe they get that as a benefit, but we also found that they were using PSB, and so we first found Dell was using PSB. Second vendor we found using PSB, AMD PSB, was Lenovo, and we actually found it in the P620. If you don't know PSB or AMD PSB, what that basically is a feature that vendor locks the CPU to the platform or the motherboard manufacturer's platform. So if you have a Lenovo system and you put one of these Threadripper Pro systems or CPUs into it, that Threadripper Pro will be a Lenovo Threadripper Pro from that point on, but it won't have any markings that'll say it's Lenovo, so you just won't know. Same thing, like, if you have like Dell or something like that, they actually are using PSB as well. And so just my personal thing is I don't necessarily love the fact that, those systems are the only ones that are out there, just because I think they create a lot of e-waste and they're not necessarily great for the environment, because once you, like, let's say you ordered a Lenovo system with like a 16 core CPU, but then later you upgrade it to a 64 core CPU, well, then that 16 core CPU doesn't, will go into the secondary market, and people will either try putting in systems that they shouldn't and they won't work, or, whatever. But we actually have a whole testing process now on our Tiny Mini Micro side to actually go and look for this, because it's such a big deal that I just think people should be aware of it. And anybody that does a review, there actually have been some reviews of the P620 with the 5995WX that haven't mentioned PSB, and frankly, I don't know how you can review that system without talking about it, because it's such a big thing in the industry right now. So anyway, just that's my key lessons learned, is just the fact that I just kind of wish that this was sooner in the process. It just seems so long, guys. This is such a cool processor, but I just kind of wish that it was earlier in the process, right? I also kind of wish that there was a Milan X. Anyway, if you do want to see all the follow-up content that we're going to have on Threadripper Pro, definitely go check out the STH main site. We'll have links in the description. Also, if you like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.